So tonight's keynote speaker, there's no one more qualified to talk about sea otters and their impacts on marine ecosystems than our keynote speaker. His pioneering studies of sea otters and kelp forest ecology helped to establish the concept of keystone species in the science of ecology. As a young graduate student, his research on sea otters in the Aleutian Islands not only changed the world of science, but set him on a long personal trajectory of ecological science research. He continues his life's work as an ecologist and distinguished professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His path to the world of sea otters, though, is kind of unlikely. He attended and graduated from 3 universities not often noted for marine science: a Bachelor of Science from the University of Minnesota, a Master's in Biology from Washington State University out in the Palouse country, and a PhD in Biology and Statistics from the University of Arizona. Between 1974 and 2007, he worked as a biologist and ecologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. In 2007, he joined the U.S. UCSC faculty and is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a Pew Fellow in Marine Conservation, and a Fellow of the California Academy of Sciences. His story and work are prominently featured in the documentary film, The Serengeti Rules, that was released in 2018. A podcast interview with Jim is posted on the Elakha Alliance website, and I encourage you to check it out and listen to it. We are also fortunate that he made the effort to write Serendipity, an ecologist's quest to understand nature, published in 2016, a book that I highly recommend. This is a fascinating, readable, and informative account of a unique career that spanned more than 4 decades across the vast geography of the North Pacific Rim. His life's work confirms that research in the marine sciences, especially, requires long time spans and broad spatial scales to gain insight into key questions about environmental processes and ecologic functions. His tale includes collaboration with many others in a variety of disciplines, a very long list of co-authored papers, and many graduate students who have gone on to distinguished scientific careers of their own. His reach in the world of ecological sciences, especially around the topic of sea otters and marine ecosystems, is long. His enthusiasm for and understanding of these issues is legendary. We are privileged to have Dr. Jim Estes as our keynote speakers, and he is going to share his screen right now.
Thank you so much, and it really is an honor for me to be invited to share this moment with you and my story. And so let's just get right on with it. I have entitled my talk, "The Diverse Influences of Sea Otters on Coastal Ecosystems," because it really is about how they influence the world we live in. And I've included a number of little small pictures here, some of which will be obvious in terms of their meanings, and others will be much more obtuse to you. For example, the red queen from Through the Looking Glass in the right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner. I'll get to that momentarily, but the intent here was to try to capture really the diversity of process and some of the very unexpected pathways by which we have discovered, my colleagues and I have discovered over the years, that otters play important roles in the world we live in. I'd just like to mention that some of the material, a very small amount of the material that I'll be showing tonight is new material. It's unpublished, and I've flagged that in the typical way. Ask for your indulgence on not using that, please. Let me, though, move to the next main point here, which is just some general introductory points. So I want to say, first of all, that we live in a world of some 15 to 100 million extant species. That's a lot. Sea otters are one amongst a very large number. If we integrate that back in time to the beginning of life on Earth, that translates to something like 1.5 to 10 billion species have existed over the history of life on Earth. This makes the number one even smaller. Embedded within that fauna, within that integrated fauna across the history of life on Earth over the last 500 million years, that is since the Cambrian explosion, which is when all of the major body plans of animals that we know today suddenly emerged. The fauna was characterized universally and in virtually every habitat, so far as we know, by large-bodied animals. There were large things living everywhere. And amidst all of the 5 major extinction events that have characterized the history of life on Earth, into this 6th mass extinction that we are entering or in the middle of right now, the loss of these large-bodied animals is perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Anthropocene. From a faunal perspective, it is the one thing that most characterizes it from any other change. So this leads to 2 fundamentally important questions for science and society going forward, and that is, how do we save these large-bodied creatures? And a related question is, what are the consequences to the world we live in if we don't? All right. So having said that with a fairly grandiose sweep into what I'm going to talk about tonight, why are sea otters important to the discussion? They are important because they are arguably, and I think arguably strongly, the best documented case study. They are a didactic tool for us to understand the consequences of these large animals to the world we live in, and related to that, an understanding of the costs and benefits to local societies of these various decisions of living with them or living without them. And in particular, the focus now on coastal Oregon, because Oregon is considering what are the costs and benefits of repatriating the coast with a species like the sea otter that was once part of this fauna but is now gone. So for this lecture, let me establish sort of a conceptual template. And that conceptual template is what we would call a network, all right? And this particular network is a network of species interactions. And that's characterized here in a way that some theoretical ecologists do, just simply by drawing an oval on the page. And let's see, can you see my cursor on the screen here? I presume you can. This is the oval, and these little circles around the perimeter of the ovals are meant to represent species, and the various lines that connect those little circles are the linkages of the network. It's the way the species and the physical environment in nature are connected with one another, all right? Those lines are what we refer to as species interactions. They are forces that dictate the degree to which one species influences the distribution and abundance of another species, all right? There are really 2 important features to this characterization of nature, this interaction web, this really obtuse conceptualization that are really important to you. And that is, 1, the interaction strength. These lines that go from species to species are variable in strength. Some of them are very narrow, characterizing relatively weak interactions. Some of them are very dark and thick, characterizing strong interactions. That's point 1. Point 2 is that these interactions occur as what we call either direct interactions, that is from here to here with no interceding species, or indirect interactions where there is one or more interceding species, all right? This becomes very important in thinking about what it is that sea otters do to nature. They have direct effects on mostly the things they eat, and they have a broad suite of indirect effects on a lot of other things. Okay, with that as the conceptual template for what we're going to be talking about, let me just tell you what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to do two simple things. One is a brief review of what we've learned over the years and an introduction into some much more recent work, some exciting new discoveries that has been led by three very young scientists. So first, the brief review, and I'm going to start off with this illustration. It comes from a review paper that several of us published several years ago on the role of large animals in oceans. And what this illustration is meant to show at the moment is that sea otters influence or live in and potentially influence three main kinds of ecosystems. They influence rocky bottom systems, the kinds of systems that we've heard most about so far, the systems in which kelp forests live. They influence what we call soft sediment systems. These are systems in which the seafloor is either mud or sand or some unconsolidated material. And the third major category of ecosystems that otters have a significant influence in are estuaries. I'm going to focus on rocky reefs exclusively. That's just because that's the system that I've worked in, and that's the system that we know the most about. You'll hear some more about estuarine systems tomorrow or the next day, I'm not sure which, from Brent Hughes's talk. So in my discussion of rocky reef systems and what we have learned, I'm going to focus on 5 main categories of things that we know, and those are listed here, and I'm going to go through them one by one. The first is what we call a trophic cascade. The trophic cascade is very simple, and that is, it is simply the notion that otters limit through a direct interaction their prey species, which in this case are herbivorous sea urchins, which in turn are capable of limiting kelp, okay? And so the trophic cascade is an indirect effect from otters to a reduction in its prey, the urchins, to an enhancement of its prey's prey, which are, the kelps, all right? So that is very simply the trophic cascade. How was that trophic cascade discovered? It was discovered very simply by comparing places where otters were abundant with nearby places where they had been abundant but had been exterminated in the Pacific Maritime fur trade. It's been reconfirmed by doing that over and over again in the North Pacific at place after place after place. It's also been reconfirmed by watching places through time as otters have repatriated new habitats. We've watched these systems change from urchin barrens to kelp-dominated habitats. And it has been seen in one particular case, which I'll speak about later, in the far western Aleutian Islands, where a system has collapsed, where the otters have gone from being abundant to rare. And in that particular case, we've watched it go the other way. So that's the basic method and the evidence for everything that I've done. It's about as simple as it could possibly be, all right? The second point I want to speak to is generality and variation, all right? And what do I mean by generality and variation? That is, this picture portrays the effect of sea otters in a very distinct and invariant way. How true is this? How much does this paradigm, does this model, does this explanation bear out from place to place to place or through time? That's the question of generality and variation. And the way in which that particular question has been addressed is simply to look at a lot of different places that were selected randomly in areas where otters were abundant, and those are all represented in these 3 panels to the left by the dark symbols, all right? The dark symbols represent places where otters were abundant, contrasted with the open symbols, which are similarly randomly selected sites at a bunch of different places where otters were absent, all right? And all of these figures represent exactly the same thing, and that is simply the abundance of sea urchins on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and the abundance of kelp on the horizontal, or I'm sorry, on the horizontal axis. All right. So for each particular place that is sampled, there is going to be some particular abundance of sea urchins and some particular abundance of kelps. And what you can see here from all of these sites that have been sampled across the Aleutian Islands is that when otters are present in abundance, sea urchins are relatively rare. That is, the value on the horizontal axis is very low, and kelps are relatively variable, but quite a bit more abundant. And conversely, when otters are absent, kelps are universally fairly rare, and the abundance of urchins is much higher, but quite variable. So this is, I think, a fair characterization for both the Aleutian Islands, Southeast Alaska, and British Columbia of the impact of otters on reef ecosystems across probably 3/4 or 2/3 to 3/4 of their range. That is from the westernmost Aleutian Islands to the Canadian-US border between Vancouver Island and Washington. Ignore the panel on the right for the moment. I'll get back to that one later. All right. So what can we say about this? Well, what we can say about it is that this effect of otters by way of the Trophic Cascade on sea urchins and kelp is, while variable, really almost ubiquitous across the North Pacific. Almost every place that we have looked with no a priori knowledge of what those systems should have looked like, other than whether otters were present or absent, has provided a very similar view of the nature of the system. Now I want to move on to what we call knock-on effects, all right? I've shown you evidence and I've shown you data that otters have substantial effects on the abundance of kelp. That might be expected to have rather substantial effects on a lot of other things because the kelps are the autotrophs. The kelps are the forests of the coastal environment. They provide habitat and they provide net primary production to that ecosystem in a fairly substantial way. So I'm going back to this illustration, focus on the greenish hued boxes here. And what this illustration shows is the Trophic Cascade, that is the effect of otters on sea urchins, on kelps, okay? And you can see the data condensed here in the form of these histograms to show how rare urchins are where otters are abundant, how abundant urchins are where otters are rare, that's the dark and the light shaded bars, and similarly, or conversely, how abundant kelp are where otters are abundant and how rare urchins are where otters are absent. And surrounding that last little box are the knock-on effects in a general way of the things that we know spin off of this trophic cascade and are linked to the presence or absence of kelp, or the abundance or relative rarity of kelp. And that is, one, high primary production. The productivity of the system is increased as best we can estimate it by about 3-fold when otters are in the system compared with when they are absent. Coastal fish populations are enhanced by kelp. They live in kelp, they feed on things that make a living off kelp, so fish are affected. The behavior of various other consumers in the system are influenced. Two groups of consumers that we actually have very good data for are seagulls, which feed in the coastal zone, and their diets are radically different depending on whether otters are present or absent, and bald eagles, which are another very common predator in the Aleutian Islands, and their diets are very different depending upon whether otters are present or absent. And the last element to this story, or to this sort of montage of effects, knock-on effects of otters on the ecosystem, is on the atmosphere and on carbon dioxide and on acidification. Kelps are photosynthesizers. The process of photosynthesis involves the absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the water, into the plants, and that in turn has an impact on the drawdown of CO2 from the overlying atmosphere and on the degree to which the ocean is relatively acidic. It has a de-acidifying effect by sucking up carbon dioxide and also as I said, a drawdown effect on the carbon from the overlying atmosphere. So these animals have amazingly broad effects on a lot of different species and other processes. Let's move on now to the next little element of our group of vignettes, and that is linkages across ecosystems. How do sea otters play into the way different ecosystems are linked with one another? And to tell this story, I've just drawn a very grossly oversimplified characterization of the world, and that is land in green, the coastal ocean next to it in light blue, and the open sea, the pelagic realm next to that in dark blue. We've been talking about processes that occur in the coastal oceans to this point. How do those relate to the land, the adjacent land on the one side and the adjacent open sea on the other? I'm going to give you two examples of work that my colleagues and I have done in this arena that establish important links. The first of these is a story that links back to the fur trade. The Pacific maritime fur trade resulted, as all of you know, in the virtual extinction of sea otters across most of their range in the North Pacific Ocean. In the Aleutian Islands, and in fact on more than 400 islands in the North Pacific Ocean and Southern Bering Sea, as a consequence of the loss of otters, an exotic fur bearer was introduced, and that was the Arctic fox. Arctic foxes were put on these islands as a revenue source to replace the lost revenue from the loss of sea otters. And they were put on these islands because the people that initiated this endeavor recognized that these islands were very productive in the form of seabirds, which would form a food base for these foxes. So the foxes were put on the islands. The foxes ate all the seabirds because there were no trees or any place for them to hide. They were basically animals that roosted and burrowed and nested on land. The seabirds, however, played a very important role in this system because while they roosted on land, they went to sea to feed. And when they went to sea to feed, they absorbed the nutrients from the prey that came from this highly productive marine environment, and they vectored those nutrients back to land in the form of regurgitated prey, their fecal material, and their dead bodies, and all the rest of it. And so this process of the birds roosting on land, going to sea to feed, and returning to land was a really important linkage between the terrestrial and oceanic ecosystem. It formed a means by which this very productive oceanic ecosystem nourished an otherwise highly unproductive land. All right. So what was the outcome of this? Well, the outcome of it was that the introduction of foxes broke this cycle. It broke this linkage from land to sea back to land again, this nutrient linkage cycle. And as a consequence of that, it completely changed the structure of the terrestrial ecosystem. And here is an example, just a photograph that shows the difference. On fox-free islands, where birds are abundant, the terrestrial ecosystem takes the form of a terrestrial grassland. On fox-infested islands, these grasses are lost because of the loss of nutrient input, and it becomes a maritime tundra ecosystem. They're very, very different systems as a result of initially the loss of otters and the introduction of foxes as a consequence of the loss of otters. So in a sort of a strange way, the otters are important in having maintained a linkage between the land and the sea, an important one. The second example is a little simpler, but somewhat less clear in terms of its empirical support. And this has to do with the linkage from whaling to sea otters to coastal ecosystems drawn in here. So what's the story? The story is that, as you all know, whaling caused a great reduction in the abundance of great whales worldwide. In the North Pacific, this started right after World War II. Industrial whaling was not really much of an endeavor in the North Pacific prior to World War II. It started up because of the global economic collapse of the Axis powers, and in particular Japan, and the desire of the Allies to bring Japan back onto its feet after the war economically. And in order to do that, they were encouraged to ramp up their maritime war machine and transform it into fishing and whaling to generate revenue. And this is the consequence. Whaling started right off the coast of Japan. Right after the war, it expanded across into the Aleutians. It greatly intensified, and by the early 1970s, it was over. And these data in this one panel from the lower right, which comes from a paper that was published by Alan Springer and colleagues in 2003 in PNAS, shows the proportion of the maximum number of whale kills within 200 nautical miles of the Aleutians that occurred starting in 1950 up until the end of industrial whaling, right at the beginning of the 1970s, and then subsequently the collapse of 3 other coastal marine mammal species. The first was harbor seals, the next were Steller sea lions, and the next were sea otters. What happened? Well, we aren't entirely sure what happened, but we're almost certain that these events were related to one another, and the hypothesis that is put forward by Springer et al. Is that these whales were an important food resource in sustaining the orca populations of the North Pacific Ocean, all right? When they were removed, the orcas expanded their diets and they began feeding more intensively on other marine mammal species that were not sustainable. And that was the harbor seals, followed by the Steller sea lions once they had been depleted, followed by the otters once they had been depleted. The only real evidence we have for the killer whale being an important intermediary in this story is from otters. And there, I think the evidence is in fact fairly strong. What we saw, and this was primarily work that was led by Tim Tinker and me back in the 1990s, along with several of our colleagues, was that we noticed that all of a sudden killer whales became much more commonly seen in the coastal ecosystem. We started to see them eating sea otters. We saw that the only place that otters persisted were in refuge habitats where the killer whales didn't have access to them, and so on and so forth. And here are the data from a paper that is in review right now that Tim Tinker put together. It's from Tinker is the principal lead on this paper. And it shows the trends in otter populations from 4 different monitoring sites: Adak Island, Amchitka, Attu, and Kiska Island. And you can see in all cases the trends are the same. And that is that these populations of otters across the Aleutian Islands simply tanked over the course of about 5 years. It was a very, very rapid decline. And the consequence was this: the systems went from being these kelp-dominated systems because of this trophic cascade to urchin-dominated systems because of the loss of the otters and the collapse of the trophic cascade. So I've given you 2 examples of how the otters figure into these bizarre linkages across ecosystems, which is an important role that they play as well. The last little vignette or story that I want to tell you is what we know or suspect or have known or suspected about the evolutionary consequences of the strong interactions that go together to form this trophic cascade. And I'm going to focus on one group of species here for a variety of reasons, and that is the herbivores and the plants. In this case, the urchins and the kelps. So in the North Pacific, because of the Trophic Cascade, the coastal ecosystem is one in which there was a very strong limiting interaction from the otters to the urchins, and consequently a very weak, almost non-existent limiting interaction from the herbivores to the plants. This would predict that there was really no reason over evolutionary time for the plants to evolve defenses to the herbivores or to herbivory, nor as a consequence for the herbivores to develop resistance to those defenses. There was no reason for there to be an evolutionary arms race from defense to resistance in this group of species. This was an idea that had its origins with a former graduate student at UC Santa Cruz, Peter Steinberg, who's now a senior faculty member at the University of New South Wales. He actually went to Australia in part to study this process. And Peter and I subsequently put together a proposal for research in which we went to the Southern Hemisphere to look at the nature of herbivore-plant interactions in a system where there never had been a sea otter. And there had never been, to our knowledge, a species that was capable of limiting the urchins. At that point, we had imagined that this system was really a true trophic level system with urchins as the apex consumer. I now think that that story was actually slightly wrong in detail. I think that it was in fact not a true trophic level system. We know that there are fishes in this system that are capable of limiting urchins and thus initiating a trophic cascade, not as strong as the one seen in the North Pacific, but nonetheless qualitatively similar. But what has been missing from this entire story is the fact that the Southern Hemisphere was also heavily populated with pinnipeds. And what we're now seeing or what people are seeing, not we, because I'm not part of this work, but what people are now seeing is with the recovery of these pinnipeds, these fish populations are being depleted, and thus it is in effect turning the system into a true trophic level system. It's in effect turning the system into one in which the herbivores are very abundant, and thus the kelps are being constantly grazed at a fairly intensive rate. What are the consequences of this? Well, one of the consequences, we believe, is the character of the chemical defenses in the kelps in the North Pacific compared with Australasia. This three trophic level system where herbivory has not been important over evolutionary time, with this even numbered system, this either 4 or 2 trophic level system in which herbivory has been important. And what we have here are simply data on the frequency distribution by the proportion of species of the concentrations of fluorotannins. Fluorotannins are a diverse group of compounds that serve a defensive role in brown algae, all of them. And what you can see from this illustration is that in Australasia, they are vastly richer in the species. On average, there's about a 10% by dry weight composition of the kelps, on average, as I say, compared with the North Pacific, where it's less than 1%. This, in turn, we believe, has had big effects on the evolution of other consumers of kelps. So what this illustration shows you is a figure that provides box plots for the shell size, the body size of extant abalones around the world. From Australia, New Zealand, the Indo-Pacific, East Africa, Mediterranean, South Africa, the Caribbean Atlantic, Japan, and the Northeastern Pacific, which are the North Pacific, which are the realm, the evolutionary heart or realm of the sea otter. Why is this? It's because the plants that these herbivores are all eating are chock-a-block full of secondary compounds all over the rest of the world, but not here. And we've shown this experimentally. We've actually done experiments where we've added these fluorotannins to the diet of North Pacific abalone and indeed have gotten a greatly diminished growth rate in the animals. Another interesting case study, again, somewhat speculative, but I think very interesting and probably true, is the importance of this interaction, this evolutionary interaction from sea otters to the quality of the kelps to the rise and fall of Steller sea cows. Steller sea cows are a dugongid sirenian that radiated from the tropics, from a species very much like modern tropical dugongs, into the North Pacific and became algivorous with the onset of late Cenozoic polar cooling. That is about 5 million years ago. These high latitude environments that we're thinking about now that otters lived in, these coastal ecosystems are really tropical, subtropical, and they became cool with the current glacial age. That drew these creatures from the tropics up into these cold kelp producing systems. And interestingly, the ocean basin where that happened was the North Pacific. Why was that? One likely explanation is because that's where the food was the very best. That's where kelps were of sufficient quality to allow the radiation of a large kelp consumer like Steller sea cows to occur. Then, with the fur trade, these kelps all disappeared. Why did they disappear? They disappeared because the otters disappeared. We know that happened. We know about when it happened. So my colleague, mostly Dan Doak and Alexander Berdin, who's a Russian, the three of us have worked on this problem, and we've actually looked at the question of whether the sea cow would likely have survived the extinction of sea otters, and the answer is no. It's almost impossible to imagine a scenario where sea cows would have survived with the kelp populations that sustained them reduced to such levels as must have occurred following the fur trade. So contrary to sort of general thinking, we believe that the sea cow was not necessarily a casualty of direct exploitation, but it was an ecological extinction that was carried forward by the loss of the sea otter. This is the final graph that I want to show you. I want to return your attention and memory to the figures I showed you about generality and variation in the North Pacific. Here are very similar data that were gathered from New Zealand, from kelp forest habitats in New Zealand. And how different are these? They're radically different. In the North Pacific, we never see abundant urchins and abundant kelps living together. In New Zealand and in Australia, they happen everywhere. These things live together. Why do they live together? Because they have co-evolved to live together. The plants are capable of resisting the herbivores. The herbivores have means of dealing with these plant defenses. And so these groups of organisms live together in Australia and New Zealand, whereas in the North Pacific, they are incapable of living together. When urchins become abundant, they simply devour all the kelps. So that's most of the story to date. And now what I'd like to do is end, and let me just see how much time I have here. So it looks like I've got about another,
You take all the time you want, Jim.
15, 20 minutes thereabouts. I kind of bumbled around there for a beginning, so I'm gonna push it over just a little bit. And I want to tell you about these new discoveries because they're really exciting. The first is work that was done under the lead of my very good friend, a young scientist at the Bigelow Marine Labs, now Doug Rasher. Doug was a postdoc with Bob Stenek and me. And his story, and the story that I'm going to relay to you, which just came out about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now in Science, has to do with the interplay between sea otters and climate change, both obviously very topical issues. The story is based on a major player in these Aleutian kelp forests, and that is these calcified algae that form a pavement over the whole bottom of the ocean and in which all kinds of other species live and on which the kelps grow, okay? So what I want to do is simply draw your attention to this panel F on the right. And what this panel shows is simply the surveys of the cover, the amount of this calcareous algae that covered the seafloor at 6 different islands that we worked at over the period of 3 years, 2014, 2015, and 2016. 2014 are the black bars. 2015 are the, I think I've got it right, 14, 15 are the light bars or open bars, and the third year are the gray bars. And what you see in every case is a very rapid decline in the percent cover of these algae. Why is that? It's because of ocean acidification and warming temperature causing this calcareous matrix that forms this alga, that forms the base of the ecosystem, to soften, all right? Acidification attacks the process of calcification in the ocean. This is one of the big worries about the effects of climate change and increased carbon dioxide on ocean ecosystems. And because of that softening, in the presence of a system that is now dominated by sea urchins, because of the lack of otters, we have what we call intensive bioerosion taking place in this system. This figure shows the skeletal densities of plants that were grown in captivity. All right, these are these calcareous algae. This is a species known as Clathromorphum nereostratum that were raised under two temperatures, current temperature and a 2-degree increase in temperature, 2 degrees centigrade increase in temperature from the norm, all right? And under 3 different partial pressure carbon dioxide scenarios: the pre-industrial level, 340 parts per million, the current level, which is about 470 parts per million, and the projected level 100 years down the line of about 850 parts per million. And when we do that, under both of these temperatures, what we see is a significant softening, a significant reduction in the skeletal density of these plants at both temperatures, with increasing carbon dioxide, and as a consequence, a significant increase in the bioerosion rates that take place in these plants. So climate change, by way of increased temperature, but in particular increased acidification of the coastal ocean waters, is having a big effect on a major player in this system. And I'll just show you this last figure. It's really a very interesting and clever one that Doug put together, and it shows from the data that we have gathered how bioerosion varied across sites with the amount of sea urchin biomass, and how bioerosion has varied through time and across sites with changes in ocean temperature. And in both cases, you can see that they go up significantly. This top panel actually shows some paleo data, and paleo over the course of about the last 50 years of the grazing rates, the visible grazing events. I shouldn't say rates, these are grazing events that we can see in the calcified skeletons of these plants, which live to be hundreds of years old. So what Doug did was simply collect these plants, section them, and he was able to see the grazing scars. And what you see here are the grazing scar rates through time at 4 islands: Ogliuga and Amchitka Island, which were islands that were characterized by abundant sea otters in the 70s through the 80s, but at which the otters collapsed in the 90s as a result of this collapse that I spoke about earlier. And 2 other islands, Allied and Attu, which essentially were otter-free, or were at least in the urchin-dominated state throughout that same period of time. And what you can see is that these grazing scars converge from the otter-dominated state, where there's relatively little grazing going on, to the otter-free state. What does this tell us? It tells us that otters in this particular system are not going to protect the world from climate change, but they have in this particular system a very significant buffering effect on the negative effect that climate change is having on bioerosion on these calcified plants, which are very important to this system. Okay, the second of the last 3 of these exciting new discoveries is work that is led by a young woman, Erin Foster. Erin is a student at the University of Victoria. She has become involved with otter-related and ecological work and is getting near the end of completion of her PhD. And some of this work that I'm going to tell you about, the work that I'm going to tell you about is one of the chapters of her work. Her work has to do with the impacts of otters on seagrass life history, genetics, and evolution, if you can believe that. It's a remarkable story, and it has to do, the key player in this story really, in addition to otters, are eelgrass. Did I say surfgrass? I meant eelgrass, I'm sorry, Erin, if you're listening on. Eelgrass. So eelgrass is an interesting plant. It's a very commonly occurring, widespread plant in coastal systems across the North Pacific and in many other parts of the world. What's interesting about it is that it has two life history morphs. One of the life history morphs is asexual. That is, these plants do not flower. They do not produce seeds. They essentially produce like aspen reproduce, and that is clonally. They grow from a single genet, all right? They grow from a single gene type, and they simply form colonies that become larger and larger and larger. And in systems that lack otters, where there is no disturbance to the seafloor, these asexually reproducing plants that form through the development of these spreading rhizoidal structures become the dominant form. When otters enter the system, they disturb the system. They actually create little patches of open habitat. What that does is it allows seeds to set, and thus it favors the sexual morph, the sexual life history morph. What are the consequences of that? Everybody knows, if you've had any biology at all, that sexual reproduction is the mechanism of evolution. It's the mechanism of the spread of genetic diversity through plants and thus evolution. So what did Erin discover? Really amazing story. What did she do? First thing she did was she went to two major sites along the coast of Vancouver, or of British Columbia. One is in the central coast and the other is down off the coast of Vancouver Island. And at both of these sites, there were places where otters had been long established. Those are the red dots. There are otter sites that otters were becoming recently established. Those are the blue, dark blue dots. And then there are places where they remained absent and have been absent for decades to perhaps more than a century. And this same sort of spatial scenario occurs both in central British Columbia and off the coast of Vancouver Island. So what she did was simply compare the genetics of the plants among these different areas. And she asked the question, is there a notable effect of the length of time that otters have been in this system on the genetic structure of these plants and of these plant populations? And the answer is very strongly yes, all right? So the light blue systems, what these are essentially discovery curves of the number of alleles in looking at larger and larger numbers of plants. And in each one of these cases, they are carried out to roughly an asymptote. And what you can see is that the number of alleles in the red, these are the sites where otters have been established for some number of decades now, are substantially higher than they are at the intermediate sites, and they in turn are significantly higher than at the unoccupied sites. The same is true for another measure, which is simply allelic richness. That's just the number of genetic alleles that are present. And another related measure, which is simply genotypic diversity. In all cases, you see a very clear signal of the switch between these two life history morphs that is being facilitated by the repatriation of otters into this system. Really a cool story, amazing work. The last story, and this is one I'm really personally very proud of, even though I didn't get it started, has to do with work that was led by Tori Gora, and Tori was an undergraduate here at UCSC, just finished a year or so ago. And she took a field class with Pete Ramundi and Christy Croker, in which they went up to Sitka Sound to do a winter course in kelp forest ecology. And Tori and several of her student colleagues went back to Sitka Sound and resurveyed sites that my colleagues and I had been working on since 1988. All right, so we have a whole bunch of sites in Sitka Sound that we started sampling in 1988 and have sampled subsequently at several times up to the present. We also have gone back and resurveyed sites in Torch Bay. What's interesting about this? Let me tell you what's interesting about it. One is that you heard today, earlier, about this the sea star wasting disease. This part of the coast, all the way up into Southeast Alaska, is right in the center of the range of the sunflower star. And they were wiped out, effectively wiped out throughout this entire area. So the most recent samples we have, compared with the earlier samples we have, provide a signature of how the loss of the sunflower stars impacts this system. In addition to that, Sitka Sound and Torch Bay differ from one another because Sitka Sound is a site where otters have been harvested in fairly large numbers over the last several years, whereas Torch Bay is within the confines of Glacier Bay National Park, and the otter population there has remained at or around carrying capacity ever since we started working there in 1988. So that's a layout of the scenario, okay? So Sitka Sound, these are data mostly from Sitka Sound now, all right? Sitka Sound was otter-free up until 1988, all right? We sampled it in 1988, there were no otters there. There were urchins everywhere and hardly a kelp to be found. We went back in 2009. In 2009, we sampled all those same sites. Otters had reinvaded probably right around 2005. They'd been there for maybe 5 years or thereabouts. They were abundant in 2009. And by that time, the urchins were gone. They were effectively absent. We had a hard time finding any of them, and kelps were everywhere. Between 2010 and 2015, there were some 1,650 otters harvested, legally harvested, from Sitka Sound, both to generate pelts and also as an effort to reduce the population, more or less experimentally, to see what the impact would be on the fisheries in that area. By 2018, when Tori and her group sampled these sites, the population was about 30% of the estimated size that it would have been in the absence of a harvest. This is work mostly that Tim Tinker has done in estimating these things, all right? What I want to show you here are what we have seen at different sites in Sitka Sound that are varying distances from the town of Sitka. And why is that important? It is important because the closer the sites are to the town of Sitka, the more intense the harvesting has been. The further and further and further it is from Sitka to a place to hunt, the less inclined the hunters are going to be to exploit animals in these areas. It's a perfect example of the marginal value theorem for those of you that study behavioral theory. And what do we see? Well, what we see in 2018 is that the abundance of otters becomes greater and greater and greater as you get further and further away from the village of Sitka. Looking down here to this middle panel, this is actually mislabeled. It should have been 2018, not 2009. We see a similar decrease in urchins, and we see a concurrent similar increase in kelps. The reason I've included panels B and D in here is these are data that were gathered on urchin abundance when we first started sampling the system in 1988, and there is no trend with distance, and kelp abundance in 2009 when we revisited the system, but before there was any harvest, and there again is no trend with distance. So these data argue that these increasing or decreasing trends of otters, urchins, and kelp are indeed a consequence of the harvest. Now the question, and the final point of my slides and final bit of the talk, has to do with what this tells us about the relative roles of harvesting otters on the one hand and the loss of Pycnopodia on the other, okay? And these are data that are in the same form as those that I showed you earlier. These are simply these phase state diagrams showing the abundance of kelp on the vertical axis and the abundance of sea urchins on the horizontal axis. And these are data from Sitka Sound, showing in blue 1988, in the reddish rust color 2009, and in the black 2018. And what you can see is when otters were absent in 2088, sure enough, it was an urchin-dominated system. There it is. And in 2009, once otters had come back into the system, it was a kelp-dominated system, and there it is. And what we are seeing now is sort of a leaking of that effect over toward the urchin-dominated state overall. If we look at Torch Bay, and this effect could be either the otters or the Pycnopodia or some combination of those two, or perhaps something else, but those are the obvious things that we know have happened in that system. In Torch Bay, we have the same reduction of Pycnopodia, but no effect of otters. And what do we see? We see essentially nothing. So in this area, whereas Pycnopodia may be a fairly important predator on urchins, in this very large sweep of space and time as an indication of the relative importance of these two species, it's the otters that seem to have by far the strongest impact on the system. Okay, so that's the story of the past. That's a little bit of a hint of some of the really remarkable new things that people are learning about this system, and there is still so much more to learn. And I want to close with a tribute to my mentor. He wasn't actually my former advisor, but a person that had more effect on me, and I think more effect on modern ecology than arguably any other single person, and that is Bob Payne. It was Bob Payne that encouraged me in 1975, when I first went to Amchitka Island, to think about whether otters were important as predators in this system, and to convince me that it was an interesting and feasible thing to do. Bob was really the generator of the term keystone species. This was a word that he coined, and he coined it because of the analogy of, in architecture, the keystone, which is this species that sits at the top of an arch, which holds it together, but when removed, the entire structure falls apart. So the view that has emerged is that these keystone species, certainly in the case of the otters, but there are other species in which these same processes have been shown, perhaps not as rigorously and not as extensively, but these keystone species very definitely influence the workings of nature, and by influencing the workings of nature, human welfare. The last thing I want to say is I think there is still a great deal to be learned. And really the question at the bottom of all of this is how we now as human societies, how you as the next generations of people going forward decide to use this information to assess the costs and benefits to the world you live in of otters either being there or not being there. So I'll close just with a word of acknowledgement, really, both for the people, the key people that have worked with me over the years, both either as field collaborators or friends or whatever, and for the major sources of support for the work that we have done: National Science Foundation, the Department of Interior, U.S. Geological Survey, Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. military, Navy, Air Force, North Pacific Research Board, and the Alaska Sea Life Center. Among these groups, there are most of the support for all of the work that my group has done over the years. So with that, I'll close. I know I am going to be stunned by the silence. One of the great things about giving a talk in person, whether you give a good talk or not, people always clap. And when you do a Zoom talk, you hear nothing. So I'll throw it open to questions. Thanks so much for your attention. And I don't know where we go from here.
I'm clapping.
Thank you, Jim. That was great talk. And this is John. I'm going to moderate some Q&A, so I will be directing some questions to you that from the audience. But we're getting lots of messages with applause and clapping. So it's virtual text clapping, but it is still there. So
I'll take whatever I can get at this point. Thank you.
exactly.
It's gotten to be a lonely world, hasn't it?
Yeah. So thank you again for the great talk. And our first question is from Mike. And Mike asked, wouldn't there have been a great deal of evolutionary time in the North Pacific where kelp and urchins interacted before the North Pacific was essentially colonized by sea otters, or before what we now know as sea otters arrived in their present form? Wouldn't this evolutionary time before otters have been sufficient to allow for some sort of development of an herbivore deterrent biochemical, adaptation?
Yeah, a great question. Good point. Absolutely true that there was a significant period of time, probably from, who knows, maybe as much as 150 years in some places, to maybe as little time as in the Aleutian Islands, maybe as little time as 50 years. In concept, yes, but from based on evidence, the indication is no. And all I can tell you is that from what we have seen and what other people have seen, these characters seem to be fairly deeply embedded genetically in the characteristics of these regional floras. So I suppose it might have happened, but it just doesn't seem that it did. And, I can't really provide an answer for why not, other than it simply didn't. And I think the only likely explanation for that is that these characteristics, these chemically defended characteristics, evolved over such long periods of time and became so deeply, so strongly under the control of fairly diverse sets of genetic control mechanisms that it just didn't have enough time for it to really switch back in a major way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Our next question is from Emily. Would genetically modifying Pacific Northwest kelp, if that was possible, with some sort of defensive chemical mechanism that would be present in Australian kelps, help give some urchin resistance? Do you think this is worth exploring?
At 75, I'll say the answer is no. But I think it's a fascinating idea. But keep this in mind, not only might you be conferring an advantage to the plants, but you might also be adding a significant detriment to the herbivores. And the process of herbivory and the process of the fueling of ecosystems from the detritus of this very chemically appealing kelp is a really important driving structure to the process in this system. So I'm not sure that it's something you would want to do, even if you could. But, we are getting to the point where we can do so many things that never even dreamed of when I was a young scientist, that I think that, if I were, and I have no idea kind of what your background or who you are or where you are, but it's something I think would be really interesting to explore. As a practical procedure, it is a pretty big problem. And so you're essentially talking about turning the whole North Pacific into a Southern Ocean kelp forest. I don't know if you really want to do that. Maybe somebody does, but it kind of reminds me, that proposal. I mean, it's a very creative and interesting proposal. It reminds me a lot of John Martin's Iron X experiment. And Martin had it all figured out. He had it figured out. He knew that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was a big problem. A lot of people knew that not that long ago. He also knew that the oceans had the capacity for absorbing a lot of CO2. And he knew that the reason that the tropical oceans didn't absorb more CO2 than they did was because of the lack of iron. And so he proposed this really brilliant experiment called the Iron X experiment, where he went out and dumped or had proposed to dump barge loads of iron across the tropical oceans of the world to suck up carbon dioxide. And he actually, Martin was quite a character, and he quipped once, "Give me a barge load of iron and I'll give you another ice age." You know, it was a great idea, but people started to get a little twitchy about that, and it never happened. And it didn't happen because it wouldn't work. It happened because they were scared to death of what the potential knock-on effects might have been of doing that.
Thanks. So our next question is from Cameron. Off the southern Oregon coast, it seems that there were fairly extensive kelp beds until the recent collapse due to apparently ocean warming in the last couple of years. Yet sea otters were exterminated circa 1910 in this region, and it's clear that historically they were fairly abundant. What might be the missing piece that allows kelp beds to have remained present in this region or this area, though otters were no longer present?
Yeah, and that's a good question. My guess is the main player that was doing it was probably Pycnopodia. There may have been some other things going on there. You know, this is outside of the geographical range of that very large area that I spoke to the question of generality and variation. So the way in which you're describing the Southern Oregon kelp forest is very much the way many people would describe the Channel Islands kelp forests. These are systems, for the most part, that lack otters, but where there's quite a bit of kelp here and there. And part of the reason for that is because there have been periodic urchin wasting diseases down there. They're more prevalent in the warmer waters further south. And so the urchins don't persist for decades after decade after decade in high abundance. They actually disappear for periods of time. The kelps get a stronghold, and then the urchins come back. There are also other consumers of kelps, in that case lobsters, fish predators, and Pycnopodia are an important predator. So I expect it has to do with some collection of factors that are related to both the slightly warmer ocean conditions and the different array of consumers that are in that system, consumers of urchins.
Yeah, in a related question from Steve, thanks, Jim. I really enjoyed your talk. And in your experience diving up in Alaska, do you think Pycnopodia numbers and more importantly, their handling their time for consuming urchins would be sufficient to actually control urchin densities? And did you notice how Catholic the diet was of these stars in Alaska? Seems like they take advantage of a wide variety of species, further reducing their ability to control urchin populations.
Yeah, I mean, Pycnopodia in Alaska live not only in rocky bottom habitats, but they occur extensively across the soft bottom habitats, and they mostly dig for clams, and they feed on bivalves in those systems. So they feed on a lot of different things. I can just relay to you something that I have seen over the course of a couple of research cruises. And this has to do with the geographic distribution of Pycnopodia across the North Pacific. So Pycnopodia does not occur in the central and western Aleutians. That's beyond the western range, the northwestern range of the species. We made a cruise once from Attu Island all the way to Dutch Harbor, and we stopped along the way and dove at many different islands. And we ran into the western range extremity of Pycnopodia, and that was in the Islands of Four Mountains. That's in the sort of central eastern Aleutians. And as soon as we got into these systems that had Pycnopodia in them, the kelp forest looked very different. They were very heterogeneous. They were very much a mosaic of patches of kelp and extensive urchin barrens. A lot of the urchins in those systems where Pycnopodia was abundant had crawled up on the kelps, were living up on top of the kelps to get away from the sea stars. It looked for all the world the way my very close friend and colleague Dave Duggins described Torch Bay in Southeast Alaska when he was working there on Pycnopodia before otters got back into Torch Bay. He described it as a mosaic where these patches of kelp and these patches of dense urchins coexisted with one another. So I think that's sort of the norm in places where Pycnopodia are abundant and otters are absent.
Okay. And maybe a follow-up question to that, in Josh's presentation, he talked about how otters were consuming urchins in areas that had standing kelp, and the urchins were obviously had more uni and they were more food value, and that they were sort of helping to protect it. He was arguing the existing kelp stands. But a couple of questions here. One from David asked, how do sea otters invade new areas or that lack kelp and consist of urchin barrens, which presumably have no caloric value? And this question's come up a lot, is if you have large barrens, many people have asked this, well, if they're not going to eat them, how does this process unfold? And maybe it's just one of time, but that's a question that's come up a lot.
So it's a great question. And if Josh is by chance listening in, he will, and he's looked at his email, he'll know that I wrote him right after his talk and asked him the same question. And I didn't ask it really because I thought he had the answer. I just thought it was an interesting contrast, because those places that people have looked at carefully where otters have expanded into these vast urchin barrens have not behaved that way. The otters have come in. If Jane Watson is listening in tonight, she was a former student of mine who worked and did most of the British Columbia work, and she chronicled these processes very, very carefully. And one of the things that Jane found that was fascinating was that as otters moved into these vast urchin barrens, what they would do was they would grab an urchin, big urchin, red urchin, they'd bring it up to the surface, crack it open, eat it, and the debris from that broken urchin would fall back to the seafloor. And around that little ball of debris, all the other urchins would split. So they sensed that there was a seriously damaged fellow that was nearby. And so they had a very strong escape response. And that created this mosaic pattern initially of kelps all through these big urchin barrens. But within a year or two, these systems had completely transitioned into kelp beds. And so we have not seen what Josh and his colleagues are seeing in Monterey Bay in the more northern areas. We have simply not seen that. And I don't know why that is. And if he's listening on, maybe he'd like to make a comment on why that is. One thing we have not done is look really carefully at the gonadal composition of these urchins in these urchin barrens. We do know that they are very impoverished, that they're very small gonads. Brenda Konar, who was at the University of Alaska now, is a professor there, is one of my former students also, who worked on urchins and kelp out in the Aleutians, showed this very clearly. I don't know.
Maybe a factor of time of, researching duration, time,
Well, it could be, although I don't think so. I mean, this has been going on now in Monterey Bay. I mean, I'm not plugged into that research program directly, but it's been going on for a few years. This phenomenon that he talked about today, and by a few years, I mean, I don't know, 3-4 years, something like that. We never saw anything that lasted that long associated with these expanding fronts of otters in Southeast Alaska or British Columbia. So I think it really raises an interesting question. If you were to put otters back into Oregon, would that system behave more like Monterey Bay, or would it behave more like British Columbia?
Our next question is from Catherine Rose, and she asked, what were killer whales feeding on in the interim between killing off whales in commercial whaling and the northern sea otter population steadily increasing?
I think they were feeding on whales all along. And I think they were basically feeding on the young and the old of the whales. Whales were so abundant relative to the abundance of sea lions and seals and sea otters that they probably were capable of sustaining a very large killer whale population. So I think the killer whales were feeding on the offput of those whale populations. And that when the whales were taken out of that system, their nutritional input was greatly reduced. That's just the hypothesis, all right? I will say that we have tried to explore the feasibility of that scenario. I've done some modeling work on that process with Dan Doak, and we've come to the conclusion that that system with the number of killer whales that are in the system today, the estimated number that are in the North Pacific, that it would at best be barely sustainable without whales being reduced to the numbers that they were reduced to.
Hmm. Thanks. Our next question.
Could I just say, if
Oh, yeah.
anybody is interested in, like, okay, so where's the documentation? If you want to write me, I'll send you a PDF of the papers.
Yeah, and we do have some of those papers, I think some of your papers on that on our website as well, and we'll try to post those on a few other spots in the symposium follow-up. There's a question from, I believe it's Neve. She asks, there's interest in de-extincting or the de-extinction of the Steller sea cow. Do you think the ecosystem could support sea cows with the current otter abundance? What effect do you think the presence of this large herbivore would have on the kelp forest ecosystem?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, a lot of dimensions of that question for quite a long time. I would say that the answer is now in the Western Aleutian Islands, no. There's simply not enough kelp there to sustain much of anything. That system has transitioned into virtually a complete urchin barrens, all the way from Attu Island in the west, all the way to about Castle Cape in the east. And so there's that large area. There are very few kelps in most of that area. The Commander Islands, perhaps there's still kelp there. I think really the bigger problem is the technical problem of de-extinction. It's a great idea, but I've talked a lot with Beth Shapiro about this, who wrote about the de-extinction of mammoths and all. And practically speaking, it's a long ways from what they can do now or what they think they will ever be able to do and actually recreating a species like that. So that's probably the bigger challenge. Is there any reason that the species couldn't be repatriated if you could get past that problem? I don't see any. And then the final question is, what effect did they have on the system? I have no idea. I never saw one. I never saw a system with a sea cow in it. And I would just draw the analogy to what we would know about sea otters and their effect on these coastal systems had they dwindled to extinction. We never got a glimpse of what effect they had on the system. So it might have been substantial, but I really don't know. I can imagine all kinds of things, but they're pretty much just pipe dreams, frankly. I can imagine that they created more detritus. I can imagine they opened the canopy up for more light to get to the bottom. I can imagine all sorts of things. There are probably things that were going on that I can't even imagine, because that's just what my experience of working in nature has shown me, that there are so many things that we have learned that we never even dreamed about until we actually saw them, like this whole killer whale thing. So I don't know, but I think it's a fascinating question. And I don't know where I would suggest you go to learn more about it, but maybe somebody will, maybe you will do it.
Thanks. I got two more questions, and one is from Larry and Cassie, and they're asking, given current conditions, what might be predicted to be the future, or what could you speculate on the viability of sea otter reintroduction in Oregon, and how long might this transformation from, say, an urchin-dominated state to a kelp-dominated state take? What's your thoughts there for Oregon?
So there was two questions there, really. One was, could it be done? Yeah, it can be done. It was done before. But let me just also point out, and this is something that you will be exploring or already are exploring, it's not an easy thing to do. You don't just take a couple of otters and dump them off and then, problem solved. So yes, I think it can be done. It was tried once before in Oregon and it failed, but it was also tried in Washington and it succeeded. And it was tried at San Nicolas Island in the Channel Islands. And even though the Fish and Wildlife Service has categorized it as a technical failure, and rightly so, in fact, that population is established and growing. So it can be done. How long would it take? Uh, you know, from what we've seen in other translocations, there is a fairly predictable lag period. That is, even successful reintroductions involve periods where the animals sort of have to get their demographic chops together, for lack of a better word. They just kind of linger. So at San Nicolas Island, they almost dwindled to extinction. The coast of Washington, they almost dwindled to extinction, but then they kind of caught on and things sort of settled in for whatever reason. And so I think you're looking at probably at least from the time of an effort to reintroduce the animals to a time when you could say that they are established, probably looking at least a decade, maybe longer. Given that, how long would it take for there to be some ecological effect? You know, there again, I can't answer that question because there's so much variation among sites in the rate at which these things happen. So I've spent most of my life waiting for this to happen in the Aleutian Islands, looking at a place, Attu Island. I spent 20 years out there waiting for it to happen. And the otters were driving the urchins down, and they were driving them down, and they were driving them down, and it never did turn into a kelp forest, right up until the time the population started to collapse with all the rest of them out that way. On the other hand, in places like British Columbia and Southeast Alaska, we're seeing shifts from urchin-dominated habitat to kelp-dominated habitat in very short periods of time. And by that, I mean weeks to months. You know, if Jane Watson happens to be on or somehow connected to this discussion, she could tell you exactly because she was living right on top of those systems when the otters came and watched them change. So it varies a lot, and I wouldn't want to hesitate to guess how long it would take. I think once you have sort of a viable colony, and by viable colony, I mean probably 50 or more animals, you're going to start seeing direct effects on the food resources. How long it may take for that to result in influences on the kelp forest, that's really going to depend a lot on the details of the natural history of the dynamics of the interaction between the herbivores and the plants. And we know that varies a lot from place to place, from what you've heard from what I had to say tonight. And for those of you that heard Josh's talk earlier, he outlined some of that interesting natural history for California.
Thanks. I got just one quick last question, and I'm going to hand it over to Bob, but we do have a question from Bob. And if sea otters are not restored along the West Coast, in places like Oregon, and Pycnopodia does not return to even near to its current numbers, what is the future of the marine ecosystem and the fisheries that depend on it?
You know, let me just preface my answer to that by saying that in every case when I've been asked a similar question over the course of my life, I've been wrong. Nature just has ways of sort of doing things a little differently than you think you understand that it should. And so I don't know. I mean, I think one possibility is that you might see something very similar to what's happened in Northern California. You know, you lose all your predators, you've lost the otter was never there, you lose the Pycnopodia, and you might wind up with a system that becomes really extensively overgrazed. I mean, that would be my best guess because I think those are sister ecosystems. You know, the far north coast of California, the southern coast of Oregon are right next door to one another. So I mean, you can imagine reasons why they might be different, but that to me is the most compelling argument for why they should be similar and what thus might happen in Oregon if something like this isn't done. Now, I mean, having said that, I don't think that it's by any means a certainty that Pycnopodia is gone forever. I mean, I lived through one of these asteroid wasting diseases. I watched them completely disappear from Central California, along with all the rest of the species, and then make a strong comeback. So we don't, you know, as I guess, I think it was Josh speaking about this, or maybe it was one of the others of you today, really know very much about the disease. I guess that was Sarah that was talking about, sorry, Sarah, if you're listening, I think it was Sarah that was talking about that. And, I was struck by just how little we really know about the dynamics of the process. We know that there's an infectious disease going on there, or at least it seems to be infectious. I'm not even sure if that's the case. I mean, it may be entirely environmentally carried, may not have anything to do with spread from living organism to living organism. I don't know. I don't think people know very much about it, frankly.
Well, thanks again, and I'm going to transfer over to Bob, and I'll have some concluding remarks.
Well, Jim, thank you so much. Can you, am I on, John? Can you hear me?
You're on.
Hey, all right. Jim, thank you so much. Your last comment reminds me of a friend from many years ago, a very wise woman that often said, "I reserve the right to be wiser tomorrow." And I think that's kind of what you're talking about here, is that just when we think we know something, we find that we don't know it, and we'll be wiser tomorrow. I think you've really wrapped this up beautifully, extensively. You're probably tired, and if I were right here with you, I'd take you out for a beer, but we'll have to do that some other time. I want to thank you so much for being on and being willing to participate in this symposium with us. It really adds to a deeper understanding and a broader understanding of a lot of these issues. So thanks so much. And as John said, we're going to link a bunch of your papers on our website. One of the things we want to do with our website is make it a rich link for all kinds of information about ecosystems and sea otters. And you've certainly got a suite of papers, and we'll post a few of them there. So thanks a lot. And again, thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in tonight. And for those of you that are going to join us tomorrow, we'll see you at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And we have 2 very good and very relevant talks tomorrow. And good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.